The ending of One Piece has allegedly been leaked, and not recently either, but all the way back in 2015, but no one took it seriously because it spoke about Luffy and his allies fighting the devil in some sort of huge war that would engulf the world. Ridiculous, right? But it is now 2025, and with everything that's happened, we need to examine this leak with a lot more seriousness than we did in 2015. And as our internet tale goes, on Thursday the 5th of March 2015, a user named Japanation Animanga made a post on 4chan, specifically the anime and manga board, and this post claimed to leak at the end of One Piece, and despite the fact that this anonymous post had not a lot to back itself up in terms of credibility, it ended up being reported on by a number of news websites such as K-Drama Stars, and after it became official news, it then spread to Reddit and all across all of the internets like a disease. I genuinely don't know how this post picked up so much traction, but even I remember seeing this, and I wasn't really heavily involved in the online One Piece community at the time either. But this ending contained spoilers for 7 major plot points, and 10 years later, as ridiculous as they sounded at the time, a number of these plot points have turned out to be true, and many others are seriously building towards a state of truth. Let's start by clearing up a common misconception, because one of the primary replies to this leak 10 years ago was, no one knows the ending to One Piece except Oda and his editor, maybe his wife if she's lucky. So look, the ending of One Piece is often treated like this closely guarded national secret locked away only in the mind vault of Eiichiro Oda, but it's not. The ending isn't something available to the public, of course, but as the commenter mentioned, Oda's editor also knows the ending of the series. However, what that commenter fails to consider is that at the time of recording this video, Oda has had 14 different editors since One Piece began, and each and every one of them know the ending. So the very first thing that happens after someone is hired as an editor is allegedly a phone call with Eiichiro Oda where he tells them everything. Primarily what the One Piece is and how the series is going to end, just so that every editor knows what it is they're working towards. And very curiously, even though they all get the same information, different editors have had different interpretations of this ending. And there was once an interview with 2 of Oda's editors where one said that the One Piece treasure itself is impossible to explain in a single word, whilst the other one vehemently disagreed. Although this could just be tag teaming contradictions to keep readers and watchers off the scent. The one thing that all 14 editors have been in complete agreement upon is that this ending is pretty spectacular. And of course, they are sworn to secrecy. To the point where there's even one editor whose girlfriend broke up with him because he wouldn't tell her the ending of the series, which I must say, absolute Chad behavior, good sir. But that's already 14 more people who know the ending. And not all 14 of them may have had the same mental fortitude as that guy. As the old quote says, 3 may keep a secret if 2 of them are dead. Because the more people you tell, the more points of compromise you have. And within the manga and anime industry, there is an untold amount of people who know the ending of One Piece, including Goro Taniguchi, who directed the very first One Piece animation project, which was an OVA, called One Piece Defeat the Pirate Ganzak, which I have here on video cassette. That's how old it is, and that's how old I am that I know what this is. Goro Taniguchi also directed Film Red, and according to Oda in an interview for Film Red, he told Taniguchi the ending of One Piece all the way back when that first OVA was being made in the 90s. And Taniguchi at the time had just been sitting on that information for about 25 years, more like 28 years now. So a lot of industry insiders who have had a major role in a One Piece project are likely to know the ending as well. And in addition to that, in 2014, Oda reportedly also told the ending to a terminally ill child as part of the Japanese equivalent of the Make-A-Wish Foundation, which was reported in an article titled One Piece Ending Revealed by Eiichiro Oda to Child Suffering from Cancer. Oda holds back tears as he reveals huge spoilers about how One Piece ends. And we're going to keep that story in mind because weirdly enough, we're going to have to come back to it later. It ties quite closely into the nature of the leaked ending itself. But let me set the stage for this leak by taking your mind back to 2015. On the day the leak was posted, the latest chapter of One Piece to come out was chapter 778, Tactics number 5, which is where Zoro defeats Pika after being thrown like a bowling ball. This is Dressrosa era stuff, and even though we're almost 800 chapters into One Piece, somehow we still have no idea where it's going. We haven't met Imu, we don't know the truth of Luffy's devil fruit, we haven't met Zunisha, Emmett, or any of Joy Boy's former comrades. In fact, Joy Boy himself is nothing but a name. We heard that one time on Fishman Island, and we don't even know that the road poneglyphs exist, and that's how we actually find Laugh Tale. We were still so shockingly naive to the world, its history, its secrets. And with that that in mind, this leaked ending appeared online mere days after chapter 778 was released, as Jap Nation Animanga posted the following. A guy named Junichiro Fumi, a guy at Shueisha who helps Oda draw the panels of One Piece, said there would be a huge war against the Devil and his army versus Luffy and his army of pirates. Fumi said that the Devil and his army have access to all of the powers that could be given by devil fruits. Luffy is already the pirate king at this point because he has united the pirates and the marines, and yes, the D's are descendants of the devil that they are fighting. That is the leak, and there is no one on this planet who could have taken that seriously at the time. But over the last 10 years, whether this leak was real or not, and we will get into examining how likely it was to be real in a bit, it doesn't matter. Either way, it's still kind of happening. Of course, the most immediate and most ball-grabbing element of the leak is the mention of the devil, which as of chapter 1150, it does appear that Imu, a character who hadn't even been introduced at the time of the leak, has a very stereotypically devilly design and demony abilities. Although to some degree the idea of a devil has been present in One Piece ever since chapter 1. Devil fruits were said to be enchanted by the sea devil and are so loathed by the sea itself that it curses the users and takes away their ability to swim in it. And within the One Piece world, there's also been an ongoing superstition that fruits each contain the spirit of a devil, which possesses the body of whoever consumes the fruit, something which has also gone on to become weirdly true in the case of Zoan fruit specifically. But even with that, the idea of Luffy facing off against a literal devil was way too ridiculous to consider in 2015. But now, it's pretty hard to deny that this is exactly where we're going. Or at the very least, it's exactly where we've already been, because the Elbaf mural flat out shows Luffy, Nika, Joy Boy, whoever it is, leaping into battle combat with a shadowy demon devil, backed by all of the allies we've made throughout the series. In the mural, we see minks, fishmen, samurai, giants, Lunarians, Tontara, and even a ship with the flag of Alabasta clashing against the devil and his forces of evil. Although something we have yet to see at the time of this recording is Imu and his Legion of Darkness having access to all devil fruit abilities. However, that is something that has also been slowly coming true through Dr. Vegapunk, whose research has now discovered the power to mimic all Paramecia and Zoan devil fruit abilities, and all of that research exists within the mind of York, who has now pledged her allegiance to the world government. So even if it's not an Emu-specific ability, we are still very much building a reality where the world government can use most, and maybe even one day, all devil fruit powers. And another big thing that the leak gets correct is the concept of one big final war in One Piece, which is potentially starting right now as we speak. And as mentioned before, this war is depicted in the Elbaf mural. The first time that we heard tell of this final war was from the journal of Kozuki Oden, and also in his letter to Toki. Over 20 years ahead of us, there will likely be a massive war terrible enough to split the seas themselves. In other words, in another 20 years, the primary figures of this great war will muscle their way into the new world. So it looks like the leak got that right as well. However, it would be a bit disingenuous to give the leak too much credit for this, because as much as we didn't confirm it until Wano, Eiichiro Oda himself actually spoiled this plot point years ago. In the year 2012, Eiichiro Oda said, "One thing that motivates me to keep drawing is that I want to draw the final saga. The final saga will be so amazing that it makes the Marine for Dark look like nothing. The Marine for Dark was just a side trip to me. I didn't expect it to be so popular." So as much as it's definitely happening, I'm not sure how much credit we can give to the leak for the idea of there being a huge final war, because we already knew that 3 years before this leak happened. But one of the most interesting parts of the leak is the idea that Luffy will already be the Pirate King by the time that the final war begins, which is very possible, especially since we now know that becoming the Pirate King isn't the end game for Luffy. That's just what he views as a prerequisite to achieve his true and currently unknown dream. Although at the moment it does feel more likely that the final war will be entwined with the fight for Pirate King, a struggle between our 4 leading candidates, Luffy, Shanks, Blackbeard, and the magnificent Buggy. And I do think it would be amazing to see even a brief era where Luffy is considered to be the Pirate King, rather than win the final war, Luffy becomes the Pirate King, does dream, and the end. But another massive chunk of this leak has to do with the idea that Luffy has managed to unite the pirates and the Marines. This is something that felt especially absurd in 2015, because if you were to do that, then there wouldn't really be anyone to fight against, or at least at the time, we didn't know there were others. However, we've recently discovered that the world nobles have a force of their own in the Holy Knights, and Imu can even create his own army of demon folk, and after seeing that, the Marines may very well flip and align with Luffy due to the more existential threat in play. I, for one, find it very difficult to believe that Sakazuki would continue to serve the world government if he was to learn about Imu. It just doesn't seem like it fits with his definition of justice. And at the very least, we are likely to see something of a Marine civil war, with the sword-affiliated Marines pursuing their own justice as they're allowed to do so, in contrast to whatever Sakazuki has in store for his absolute loyalists. And in any case, I do think that a union of pirates and Marines is what we're heading towards, with Luffy and Kobe as the respective figureheads. But then, of course, there's the most insane part of the leak, which is the claim that everyone with the Will of D is a descendant of the devil being fought against. All of our Luffys, our Rogers, our Solstices, they're all from Imu, implying that every D is biologically related to this D evil, or maybe even the original devil before him. And at this point, this is actually the only part of the leak that I do still have trouble getting behind. It could be the case, and maybe there's been a historical issue with Imu being able to control those with the Will of D as a result, but this is where the leak loses me a bit, and I have to remind myself about just how reliable this information really is. Because there is no doubt that this was an incredibly stunning prediction for 2015. It is mostly aged like fine wine. However, there is a big however, as the thing that gives this leak the most credibility, other than the fact that it is starting to sound like what's happening in the manga right now, is that Jap Nation Anime Manga went and dropped a real human named Junichiro Fumi. So it wasn't just citing an anonymous source. And it was alleged that this Junichiro Fumi was an assistant on One Piece, but unfortunately this is extremely difficult to verify. To the best of my knowledge, manga assistants aren't credited in the published volumes, at least not for One Piece. Some manga series do credit assistants, but it might just be a Shueisha policy not to. I feel like that might make the assistants easier to control, because if you've got your name attached to something like One Piece, then it might be easier to get a job with another publisher. But if you've got no public identity whatsoever, then you've also got no artistic footprint to show for yourself. Alternatively, it could also be to preserve the integrity and the image of the author, like how we have this whole cult of Goda that has developed over the course of One Piece. And look, the dude does work extremely harder than most of the planet, only sleeping 3 hours a day and everything. But if we also had a list of like 10 credited assistants, then it might break the illusion a bit. Although it's not like they're a secret. The last time Oda commented on it, I believe he said he had about 5 assistants, and he does sometimes talk about them in SBS segments, but he always uses pseudonyms. He never uses their real names, which brings us back to the assistant in question. After consulting with Arta from the Library of Ohara, he's also pointed out to me that Fumi is all but unheard of as a family name in Japan, with the exception of one specific region. And even if you do have the powers of Japanese, there is no online evidence available to prove whether or not this person even exists. And so it becomes quite likely that this is a made-up name from someone not intimately familiar with Japanese culture. To be clear, it's not impossible for someone to be named Junichiro Fumi, but I would say that it is extremely unlikely given what I have to tell you next. If you recall the story I told earlier about the terminally ill child who Oda allegedly told the ending of One Piece to, well, that story was also first reported on K-Drama Stars, the same website that first published the leaked ending. And their source to the terminally ill child story just so happened to be our old mate Jap Nation Anime Manga. And this is where things actually get a bit weird and off-putting, because this article didn't just mention some anonymous child. The child themselves was named, full name and everything. It was reported that a child called Hinata Fujinami had been given a diagnosis of lung cancer, and if you even have a beginner's grasp of Japanese, you will have already realized that there is a big problem there. Because Hinata is a name that cannot exist in the Japanese language. Hinata. That T sound at the end doesn't exist in Japanese. You can have ta, you can have to, you could have su, you could even have te if you wanted to, but there is no T. Now, to be fair, it could just be a misspelling by the guy who wrote the article, whose name is Gunther Barbosa, which also sounds fake as crap. We'll get to that. But the name is mentioned multiple times, and it is always spelled as Hinata. And in addition to that, according to Arta, there is absolutely no record of either of these stories in the Japanese-speaking community. It's only English speakers and some Europeans who have pounced on this, who know about this alleged leak and the terminally ill child stuff. And given that both of these stories supposedly originate from Japan, there is no way that either of them would have gone unnoticed. So if I may, I'd like to make an accusation here. And what I'm going to do, right, is I am going to j'accuse the crap out of Japanation Animanga for making all of this up. And to get a bit conspiratorial, I'd also suspect that he was involved in the K-Drama Stars News website, given that they are always the ones who so diligently published his stories, with both articles, The Leak and The Child with Cancer, having been written by the same author, Gunther Barbosa. And who knows, maybe Gunther Barbosa and Japanation Animanga are actually the same person, and he was making up sources for his own stories. And you know what? Usually that wouldn't bother me. The ending leak is whatever. It's the internet. You can never expect honesty. But even then, making up the story about the kid with the cancer is still a pretty dick move. But putting that to one side, even though this 10-year-old leak is 99.9 so many 9% complete and utter bullshit, it is still a matter of interest just how accurate it's becoming over time. And at this stage, Japanation Animanga, if that is indeed your real name, you may end up being the one person on this planet who correctly called the ending of One Piece. And he did so whilst trying to make up the most ridiculous conclusion possible to troll people. And we couldn't have known this at the time, but going with the most ridiculous possible option just so happens to be Eiichiro Oda's preferred path as well.